is. Below is a rewritten version from a different perspective, preserving the original content while shifting the focus toward asterisk, the corruption of the power apparatus when the state is used to protect one individual, instead of protecting the truth and the victims. There are scandals that are frightening not only because of what they reveal. They are even more frightening because of how power reacts when the truth begins to emerge. In a normal democracy, when sensitive victims appear involving a network of sexual abuse, underage victims, wealthy individuals, and powerful figures, the first response of the state should be protect the victims, investigate to the end, disclose what can be disclosed, and ensure that no one stands above the law. But in the Epstein files story, what is shocking is not only the content of the documents. What sends a chill down people's spines is the feeling that the machinery of power has operated in the opposite direction. Instead of asking, have the victims been heard? Those at the center of power seem to have asked, how do we make sure this does not hurt Donald Trump? That is the core of the entire story. According to the content being discussed, the New York Times revealed a confusing and highly unusual detail. Strategic discussions around the Epstein files were said to have taken place inside the Situation Room, the room associated with the most serious national security decisions in the United States. This is where presidents and senior officials deal with war, terrorism, nuclear crises, cyber attacks, hostage situations, and events that could threaten American lives. But if that room was used to discuss how to control media coverage of Epstein, then the story has moved beyond the realm of a personal scandal. It becomes a sign of the state's function being turned upside down. The Situation Room was not built to protect the reputation of a president. The Department of Justice does not exist to selectively manage information that benefits the White House. The FBI is not the media response team of any political individual, and the White House has no right to turn files related to abused victims into a problem of image management. When public authority begins to behave like a personal protection campaign, democracy enters a dangerous zone. What makes the matter even more serious is the reaction after the information appeared. Instead of the first question being, why were senior officials discussing the Epstein files in a national security space? The response described was to launch a hunt for the leaker. In other words, the problem was no longer the content being hidden, but who allowed the public to know that it was being hidden. This is the familiar logic of power when exposed to the light. Do not pursue the truth, pursue the person who brought the truth out. When an administration worries more about the whistleblower than about what was revealed, the public has reason to be suspicious. When the question, who spoke to the press, becomes more important than the question, have the victims received justice? The state has lost its basic moral order, and in the Epstein case, that moral order has been reversed too many times. Jeffrey Epstein was not an ordinary figure. He became the symbol of a network where money, sex, power, friendships with elites, and the silence of the justice system all merged together. For years, the victims had to watch powerful people step over their stories as if they were merely a media inconvenience. Epstein died in prison. Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted. But the larger questions remain. Who participated? Who knew? Who was protected? Who escaped accountability because they were too rich, too famous, or too close to power? That is why the Epstein files are not merely a set of documents. They are a moral test for the state. If the state makes the truth public, even when that truth hurts powerful people, then citizens can believe that justice still has meaning. But if the state chooses to protect the powerful first and only considers the victims later, then Epstein is no longer a case from the past. It becomes an open wound in the American rule of law. In the original content, Marjorie Taylor Greene was mentioned as someone who said directly that Trump had once been concerned that releasing the files could harm people he knew, his friends. This detail is important because it shows a crack inside MAGA itself. It is not only Democrats or opposition media asking questions. Some Republican figures also recognize that the way Trump handled the Epstein files was a massive political mistake. Trump once called this story a scam, a hoax, something inflated to attack him. But the more he tried to deny it, the bigger the story became. The more he tried to delay, the more suspicion grew. The more allies like Mike Johnson blocked the bill from being brought to the floor, the more the movement demanding the release of the files turned into a bipartisan revolt. That is what makes the Epstein files different. They no longer fit neatly into the polarized line of Democrats versus Republicans. When Thomas Massie, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Nancy Mace, Lauren Boebert, and the entire Democratic side all support the demand for disclosure, the story has moved beyond the usual partisan script. It becomes a question that many Americans from different camps are asking together. If there is nothing to hide, why fight so hard to stop the files from being made public? That very question traps Trump. According to the original content, Trump eventually had to sign the bill not because he wanted to, but because the political pressure had become too great. This was described as one of his biggest miscalculations, underestimating the anger of his own voters over the Epstein issue. MAGA had been fueled by the promise of fighting elites, fighting hidden power networks, and fighting those protected by the system. But when the Epstein files became a real issue, many people in that movement saw Trump himself standing on the side of delay. This is the fatal paradox for Trump. The man who built his image as a destroyer of the system is now suspected of using that system to protect himself. And that is why the accusations that the White House, DOJ, FBI, and senior officials were involved in shaping the strategy around the Epstein files became explosive. If the information described is accurate, this is not merely media spin. It is a model of coordinated power. The White House handles the politics. The Department of Justice controls the legal side. The FBI holds the files. Friendly media can be used to shape the story, and everything revolves around one central goal: minimizing damage to Donald Trump. In an ordinary case, law enforcement agencies must follow the evidence. But in a politicized system, the evidence risks being forced to follow the interests of the person at the top. That is the greatest danger. No one needs to assert that every allegation in the Epstein files is true. The original content itself also emphasizes that many allegations remain unverified, that there are anonymous calls, and that there is testimony that cannot yet be confirmed. But the existence of unverified allegations is not a reason to bury the files. It is a reason to investigate properly, classify the material, verify it, remove false information, protect sensitive information about victims, release what serves the public interest, and most importantly, do not allow politically connected individuals to decide which parts are seen and which parts are hidden. If the FBI created a list of allegations involving many famous people, politicians, and Trump himself, the reasonable question is not, how do we prevent this list from being misunderstood? The reasonable questions are, which allegations have been checked? Who checked them? How independent was the process? Were there conflicts of interest? Did anyone in the White House or the Department of Justice pressure investigators to soften, delay, or shape the conclusion? Because in cases involving powerful people, public trust does not depend only on the result. It depends on the process. A conclusion of no evidence carries weight only if the investigative process is independent, serious, and transparent. But if the public has already seen strategic meetings, attempts to delay, hunts for leakers, contradictory statements, and people close to the president discussing how to handle the story, then even a correct conclusion can lose credibility. That is the cost of politicizing justice. Another point in the original content that deserves attention is the role of Vice President J.D. Vance. According to the quoted remarks, Democratic lawmakers wanted Vance, Susie Wiles, Kash Patel, and others to answer questions about the meetings said to have taken place in the Situation Room. This is a serious political escalation because it moves the story from Trump and the Epstein past to how the entire current apparatus may be participating in protecting Trump. If a vice president, a White House chief of staff, an FBI director, an attorney general, and a communications team all participate in a strategy to handle a set of files that could harm the president, then this is no longer a private matter. It is a question of abuse of state structures. The original content also mentioned the idea that Tucker Carlson could interview Ghislaine Maxwell to help clear Trump, or at least reshape the story. Although this detail must be handled as an allegation or a description from a political source, the logic itself shows one thing. Instead of placing the victims at the center, the media strategy may have placed the powerful person at the center. Maxwell was convicted for her role in Epstein's network. If someone like that were used as a media tool to clean up a president's image, it would be an extremely dark moral moment, because then, once again, the victims would be turned into background scenery. The story would no longer be about the girls who were abused, the lives that were destroyed, or the years in which they were not heard. The story would become, can the powerful man escape political damage? That is precisely the cruelty of power in the Epstein case. The victims are always pushed to the margins. When Epstein was alive, they were doubted, delayed, ignored, and further harmed by a justice system that was far too gentle toward the rich. When Epstein died, they were pulled into conspiracy theories where their real pain was replaced by a war between political factions. When the files are raised again, they remain at risk of being turned into tools. One side uses them to attack the other side uses them to defend itself. The media uses them for shock, and the victim's truth still waits for justice. If there is one moral principle that must remain at the center, it is this. The Epstein files do not belong to Donald Trump, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, or the media. They belong to justice for the victims and to the public's right to know. That is why the slogan, "Release the Epstein Files," has such power. It is not only a demand to publish documents, it is a demand to break a tradition of protecting powerful people. It is a declaration that no one, whether a president, billionaire, prince, tycoon, or media figure, should be allowed to hide behind a curtain of secrecy if they are connected to a network of abuse. In the original content, one argument goes even further. Releasing the Epstein files could even be a matter of national security. That argument may sound strong, but it has its own logic. If the files show connections between Epstein, intelligence circles, foreign figures, international power networks, and people who currently hold or once held power, then concealment is not merely a moral scandal. It could create risks of blackmail, manipulation, and external pressure. A president suspected of having hidden sensitive information is a politically vulnerable president. A justice system that holds files the public does not understand the reasons for withholding creates a vacuum of suspicion. And in that vacuum, forces inside and outside the country can use secrets as weapons. Therefore, transparency is not only a moral issue. It is a matter of protecting the state from being controlled by secrets. The original content also connects the Epstein files to foreign policy crises, especially war, Iran, Gaza, Israel attacks, and the possibility that major events could be used as distractions. This is a controversial but understandable point within the logic of political media. When an internal scandal becomes too dangerous, external crises can shift public attention. People are pulled into questions of war, security, missiles, casualties, allies, and war crimes, while the Epstein files issue is temporarily pushed downward. One does not need to claim that every military action is a distraction to see that Trump benefits when attention moves away from Epstein. And that is why the narrator in the original content says that one of the most important things for national security may be releasing the files. Because without disclosure, every new crisis will be suspected of being a smokescreen. Every foreign policy decision will be seen through a lens of suspicion. Every attack, every emergency statement, every media storm will raise the question, is this happening for the national interest or for the political interest of one person? An administration cannot function effectively if citizens always suspect that everything is a distraction, and that suspicion does not appear naturally. It is created by previous acts of opacity. When Trump calls the Epstein files a hoax, then is pressured into signing the bill. When former allies turn around and demand disclosure. When there is information about strategic meetings in the Situation Room. When the response is to hunt the leaker. When the DOJ and FBI are accused of focusing more on controlling information than investigating. When a list of allegations exists, but the public does not understand the verification process. When the victims are still waiting for justice. All of those pieces form a picture that people cannot easily ignore. In that picture, the biggest question is not how many times Trump's name appears in the files. The bigger question is, why did the system react as if the public knowing the truth was the threat? A healthy democracy does not fear documents. It fears concealment. It does not fear investigation. It fears interference in investigation. It does not fear the press. It fears power hunting down those who reveal information instead of dealing with wrongdoing. It does not fear difficult questions. It fears when those at the top of the state behave as if they have the right to choose which truths are allowed to exist. If the Epstein files truly contain a great deal of false information, release them responsibly, with annotations, classification, protection for victims' identities, and the removal of unnecessarily harmful material. If many allegations are baseless, a transparent process will show that. If Trump is not connected to criminal conduct, an independent and public investigation will clarify that better than any media campaign. But if the files are held back, managed, delayed, spun, and brought into a strategic meeting room, then that behavior itself will feed suspicion forever. This is the lesson power often fails to understand. Concealment sometimes causes more damage than the truth. The truth may hurt, but concealment creates a cancer of trust. And trust is the hardest thing to restore in a republic. Once people believe the Department of Justice is not independent, every case becomes suspected of being political. Once people believe the FBI can be used to protect the president, every investigative conclusion is questioned. Once people believe the Situation Room can be used to handle a personal scandal, every national security statement loses some of its weight. Once people believe Epstein's victims are placed behind the interests of the powerful, every promise of justice becomes hollow. That is why this story is not only bad news for Trump, it is bad news for the entire system if the system does not correct itself. In an ordinary moment, the fact that a president is mentioned in unverified files would be something to handle carefully. No one should be convicted by rumor. No one should be judged by leaked fragments of information. But caution toward allegations does not mean protecting secrecy at all costs. On the contrary, because the allegations are serious and sensitive, they require an independent, transparent, supervised process that is not controlled by people with conflicts of interest. Justice cannot be something granted by people who have a stake in the outcome. If Trump, the White House, the DOJ, the FBI, or anyone politically connected to the files is involved in shaping their release, then outside oversight is necessary. Congress must have access. The courts must have a role. The victims must be protected. The public must know the portion of truth that can be disclosed, and every allegation must be clearly distinguished. What has been verified, what has not been verified, what is false, and what needs further investigation. Only then can the current toxic cycle be escaped. Rumor, denial, leak, outrage, concealment, and then another leak. The final thing that must be emphasized is that the victims must not disappear from the story. They are not props for the anti-Trump side. They are not a problem for the pro-Trump side. They are not content for the media. They are people who said they were harmed by a real network, a network that for years was protected by money, power, silence, and the failure of the justice system. If the debate over the Epstein files revolves only around how much Trump is harmed, what Vance knew, whether Tucker Carlson interviews Maxwell, or how the DOJ handles media strategy, then we repeat the old mistake, placing the powerful at the center and pushing the victims out of the frame. True justice must begin in the opposite direction. Ask what the victims need. Ask who failed to investigate. Ask which files were held back. Ask who benefits from the public not knowing. Ask why power is so afraid of transparency. Ask why a room built for national security could be pulled into a story about protecting a political image. And finally, ask the simplest question: if the truth does not threaten the innocent, why are they so afraid of releasing it? The Epstein files are not only files about the past. They are a test of the present. They force America to decide whether the law applies to everyone. They force those who once shouted about fighting elites to prove that they truly dare to confront elites when those elites stand close to their leader. They force the Department of Justice and the FBI to prove that they are not tools of personal protection. They force Congress to prove that oversight is not merely a partisan game. And they force the public to remember that behind every file, every name, and every media battle, there are still victims who have waited far too long. If Trump truly wants to extinguish suspicion, there is only one path: transparency. Not media strategy. Not hunting leakers. Not calling everything a hoax. Not using media allies to reshape the story. Not turning the Situation Room into a scandal management room. Transparency. Release the files responsibly. Protect the victims. Classify the allegations. Conduct an independent investigation. Let the truth stand on its own. Because in a democracy, truth is not a threat to the state. Truth is the foundation of the state. Only those who fear the truth behave as if the public is the enemy.